The phone rang at 11 at night, and Alina Voss almost let it go to silence. She was sitting on the floor of her small apartment, surrounded by old letters that still smelled of dust and candle wax, letters her grandmother had kept hidden inside a locked wooden box for as long as Alina could remember. She picked up the phone on the fourth ring, expecting a wrong number. Instead, a calm, formal voice on the other end asked if she was the granddaughter of Margaret Voss. Her hand tightened around the phone. Nobody had asked about her grandmother in years. The voice belonged to a man who did not give his name. He said only that she was expected at Castellan Hall within 3 days, and that the matter concerned an old family agreement that could not wait any longer. Before Alina could ask a single question, the line went dead. She sat there in the quiet apartment, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit, staring at the pile of letters on the floor. Some of them were written in a language she had learned as a child but rarely used as an adult. Latin. Her grandmother had insisted on it, evening after evening, when Alina was young and impatient and wanted to be outside playing instead of memorizing verb endings at the kitchen table. She had not thought about those lessons in years. Now, somehow, they felt like the only solid ground beneath her feet. 3 days later, Alina stood at the end of a long gravel driveway, looking up at a house that seemed built to remind visitors of their smallness. Castellan Hall rose in pale stone against a gray sky, its windows tall and narrow, its front doors carved with a crest she recognized from the letter that had summoned her. A crest with a hawk and a sword, and beneath it, a line of Latin words she had translated instinctively the moment she saw them. Strength through knowledge. It seemed like a strange thing for a family known mostly for wealth and silence to carve into their front door, but she supposed every family liked to believe something noble about itself. A servant met her at the entrance, an older man with careful eyes and a voice that gave away nothing. He led her through a corridor lined with paintings of stern faces, all of them watching her pass as if measuring whether she belonged there. She did not feel like she belonged there. She felt like a woman who fixed broken bindings and cataloged forgotten manuscripts in a university library, which was exactly what she was, and she had no idea why any of that mattered to a family like the Castellans. The servant stopped in front of a set of double doors, knocked twice, and opened them without waiting for an answer. Inside was a study larger than her entire apartment, with a domed ceiling painted in faded gold and a floor of dark marble that echoed with every step. 3 men sat behind a long table, dressed in identical dark suits, papers spread neatly in front of them. They looked up when she entered, and for a moment none of them spoke. They studied her the way someone studies an object they are deciding whether to buy. The oldest of the 3, a narrow man with silver hair and a face like carved stone, gestured toward a single chair placed across the table from them. Alina walked to it and sat down without being asked twice. She noticed there was no chair beside her for anyone else, no family member, no friend, just her alone against 3 men who had clearly done this before. The narrow man introduced himself as Gerald Ashcombe, and the 2 beside him as Adrian Locke and Nathaniel Price. He said the names quickly, as if they did not matter, as if she would forget them the moment she left the room. Then he opened a leather folder and slid a single page across the table toward her. Alina looked down at it. The page was covered in dense, formal Latin, the kind used in old legal documents, full of long words and careful clauses. She recognized the structure immediately, though she kept her face still and unreadable. She had spent years reading documents just like this one in the university archive, contracts and wills written centuries ago in the same formal style. This one, however, was recent. The ink was fresh. Gerald Ashcombe folded his hands and spoke, his voice smooth and unhurried, the tone of a man who had delivered the same speech many times before. He explained in English that her grandmother had once worked for the Castellan family many years ago, translating and cataloging a private collection of historical documents. He said that certain papers from that collection had gone missing after her grandmother's employment ended, and that those papers, along with any related materials still in the Voss family's possession, were the rightful property of the Castellan estate. Alina kept her hands folded in her lap. She said nothing yet, though a dozen questions were forming in her mind. She wanted to know what papers. She wanted to know why now, so many years after her grandmother had died. She wanted to know why 3 lawyers had been sent instead of a simple letter. But she had learned from years of working with careful, guarded people in academic circles that silence often revealed more than questions did. So she waited. It was Adrian Locke who spoke next, leaning back in his chair with an expression that bordered on amusement. He turned to Nathaniel Price and said in Latin that the girl looked exactly as they had been told. Quiet, uncertain, easily persuaded. He said it lightly, almost carelessly, the way people speak when they believe no one around them can understand. Alina's face did not change. Inside, something sharpened. Nathaniel Price replied, also in Latin, agreeing that this would likely be simple. He said the sum they had prepared to offer was more than generous for a woman who worked in a library and lived, as he put it, modestly. He said it with a small, satisfied smile, glancing at Alina as if checking whether his words had landed anywhere at all. They had not landed the way he expected. Alina felt something settle inside her, cold and clear, like ice forming over still water. She thought of her grandmother's voice, patient but firm, correcting her pronunciation at that kitchen table decades ago. She thought of the hours spent memorizing declensions while other children played outside. She thought of her grandmother saying more than once that a person who understands a language others assume she does not know holds a kind of power that cannot be taken away. Gerald Ashcombe slid a second page toward her, this one listing a figure, a number meant to settle the matter quietly and quickly. He explained, still in English, that if she signed today, the family would consider the matter closed, and she would receive payment within the week. He said it as though he were offering her a gift rather than asking her to give something away. Alina did not reach for the pen sitting beside the papers. Instead, she looked at Nathaniel Price and asked, in perfectly fluent Latin, whether the figure they had proposed accounted for the second collection of letters mentioned in the Annex Clause, the one referencing correspondence protected under an older family agreement. The room went completely silent. Adrian Locke's confident expression faltered first. Nathaniel Price sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, as though the words had physically struck him. Gerald Ashcombe, the only one among them who managed to keep his composure, stared at Alina with narrowed eyes, recalculating everything he thought he knew about the woman sitting across from him. Alina continued, her voice calm and steady, switching easily between Latin and English as she read certain lines of the contract aloud, pointing out inconsistencies buried in the formal language, clauses that seemed designed to be overlooked by someone who could not read them in the original tongue. She noted, still in Latin, that a lawyer should be more careful about what he says in a language he assumes his opponent cannot understand. For a long moment, nobody in that grand, gold-ceilinged room said a word. And then from the doorway behind them, a new voice spoke, low and measured, carrying just a hint of quiet admiration. "It seems," the voice said, "my lawyers have made an assumption they will regret." Alina turned toward the sound. A tall man stood in the doorway, his dark coat still damp from the rain outside, his expression unreadable but his eyes fixed directly on her with an intensity that made the 3 lawyers straighten in their seats immediately. She did not need to be told who he was. The crest on his coat matched the one carved into the front doors. The Duke of Castellan had been listening the entire time. Duke Aurelio Castellan stepped fully into the room, and the air seemed to shift with him. The 3 lawyers rose from their seats at once, straightening their jackets, suddenly looking less like powerful men in control of a negotiation and more like schoolboys caught somewhere they should not have been. Alina remained seated, though every instinct told her to stand as well. She decided against it. She had already spent the last few minutes proving she would not be pushed into a smaller shape than she actually was, and she did not intend to start folding now. Aurelio walked slowly toward the table, his footsteps unhurried against the marble floor, his eyes moving between his lawyers and the woman who had just dismantled their careful plan in under a minute. He stopped beside Gerald Ashcombe's chair and looked down at the papers spread across the table, the contract still lying untouched where Alina had left it. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Were you planning to keep this conversation entirely in a language you assumed she could not follow?" Gerald Ashcombe cleared his throat, his composure cracking at the edges. He explained, with visible effort to sound reasonable, that it was standard practice to discuss strategy privately during negotiations, and that no disrespect had been intended. Aurelio's expression did not change, but something in his eyes made it clear he did not believe a word of that explanation. "Strategy," Aurelio repeated slowly. "Is that what you call insulting a guest to her face while assuming she cannot understand you?" Nathaniel Price opened his mouth to offer some defense, but no words came out. Adrian Locke stared down at the table, his earlier confidence entirely gone. For the first time since Alina had walked into that room, the three men who had held every advantage looked genuinely uncertain of what would happen next. Aurelio turned to Alina, and his expression softened, though only slightly. He studied her for a long moment, the way a person studies something they had expected to be simple and discovered was not. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of quiet respect she had not expected from a man in his position. "You read Latin," he said. "It was not really a question." "My grandmother taught me," Alina answered. "She believed it would matter one day. I think she would find it satisfying to know she was right." Something flickered across Aurelio's face at the mention of her grandmother, a flash of recognition that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. He pulled out the chair beside Gerald Ashcombe and sat down across from Alina himself, taking the lead in a conversation his own lawyers had clearly lost control of. He asked her, gently but directly, what she knew about her grandmother's time working for his family. Alina chose her words carefully. She explained that her grandmother had rarely spoken about those years, only mentioning once or twice that she had worked as a translator for a wealthy family whose name she never revealed. She said her grandmother kept a locked box of documents that Alina had only opened after her death, filled with letters, notes, and fragments of correspondence written in careful, formal Latin, some of them referencing names and events Alina did not fully understand. Aurelio listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled in front of him, his expression thoughtful. When Alina finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "Your grandmother," he said slowly, "did more for this family's history than anyone currently sitting in this room understands. She did not simply translate documents. She protected them. There were people decades ago who wanted certain records destroyed entirely, records that would have embarrassed my grandfather and damaged this family's reputation beyond repair. Your grandmother refused to let that happen. She took copies of those records for safekeeping before anyone could destroy the originals, and she kept them hidden for the rest of her life." Alina felt something tighten in her chest, a mixture of pride and confusion. She had always known her grandmother was careful, private, and unusually devoted to old languages and older secrets, but she had never imagined the full scope of what that devotion had actually meant. "Then why?" Alina asked, choosing her words slowly. "Did your lawyers just try to buy those same documents from me as though they were stolen property?" The question landed heavily in the room. Gerald Ashcombe shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Aurelio turned toward his lawyers with an expression that had grown considerably colder than before. "That," Aurelio said, "is an excellent question, one I intend to have answered thoroughly and soon." Gerald Ashcombe attempted to explain that the family's legal department had drafted the agreement based on instructions received from an earlier advisor, someone who had since left the estate's employment, someone who had apparently characterized the missing documents as stolen rather than protected. Aurelio listened with visible impatience, his jaw tightening as the explanation unfolded. "So," Aurelio said finally, his voice sharp enough to make all three lawyers flinch, "you built an entire strategy around insulting a woman whose grandmother saved this family from disgrace, based on the word of an advisor who is no longer even here to defend that account." None of the three men answered. The silence in the room stretched long enough that Alina almost felt sorry for them, though the feeling did not last. Aurelio turned back to Alina, and this time his expression carried something closer to genuine warmth. He explained that his own understanding of the situation had been incomplete until this very conversation, that he had trusted his legal team to handle matters he assumed were straightforward, and that he now understood the situation was anything but straightforward. "I owe you an apology," he said simply. "Not just for the tone of this meeting, but for the assumption behind it. My family benefited from your grandmother's courage, and instead of honoring that, my own people tried to reduce it to a transaction conducted in a language they assumed would keep you from noticing." Alina did not answer right away. She thought of the letters sitting in her apartment, some of them still untranslated, filled with careful handwriting and hidden meaning. She thought of her grandmother, sitting at that kitchen table decades ago, insisting that language was not just communication but protection, a kind of armor that could not be seen until it was needed. "I would like to know what's actually in those documents," Alina said finally. "Not the version your lawyers were prepared to summarize for me, the real history, all of it." Aurelio studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as though something had just been decided that could not be undone. "Then perhaps," he said, "it is time we stopped discussing you as a problem to be settled, and started discussing you as the only person who might actually understand what my family has spent generations trying to hide." Behind them, Gerald Ashcombe shifted the papers on the table, no longer certain whether the contract in front of him still meant anything at all. Adrian Locke and Nathaniel Price exchanged a glance neither of them bothered to hide, both clearly recalculating whatever future they had imagined for themselves within the Castellan estate. Alina felt the weight of the moment settle over her, heavier than she expected. She had walked into that house believing she would be asked to sign away a piece of her grandmother's memory in exchange for a modest sum of money. Instead, she found herself sitting across from a duke who seemed to be asking her, in his own careful way, to help him understand a truth his own family had spent decades trying to bury. "Before we continue," Alina said, glancing toward the three lawyers still seated stiffly around the table, "I think it's fair to say the terms of that contract are no longer acceptable. Not the number, not the language, not the assumption that I would simply sign without understanding exactly what I was giving away." Aurelio almost smiled at that, an expression that looked unfamiliar on his otherwise composed face. "No," he agreed, "I imagine they are not." He turned to his lawyers and instructed them, in clear and deliberate English this time, to draft an entirely new agreement, one that reflected the true value of what Alina's grandmother had done for the family, and one that would be read aloud, in full, in whatever language Alina preferred, before anyone expected her signature. Gerald Ashcombe nodded stiffly, gathering the old contract from the table with visibly shaking hands. As the three lawyers rose to leave the room, Nathaniel Price paused near the door and looked back at Alina, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to embarrassment. He offered a quiet apology, his voice lacking any of the polish it had carried earlier. Alina accepted it with a small nod, though she made no effort to make him feel more comfortable than he deserved to feel. When the door closed behind the three men, the room felt suddenly larger, quieter, and strangely more honest. Aurelio remained seated across from Alina, studying her with an expression that had shifted from careful formality into something more curious, almost personal. "Your grandmother," he said after a moment, "kept this family's darkest history safe for longer than anyone realized. I think it's time someone finally told you why that history mattered so much in the first place." Alina leaned forward slightly, her earlier caution giving way to something sharper, more determined. Whatever secrets waited behind that story, she intended to hear every single one of them, in whatever language they needed to be told. Aurelio rose from his chair and walked toward a tall cabinet at the far end of the study, one Alina had not noticed until now, tucked into a shadowed corner beneath a painting of a stern woman in old-fashioned dress. He unlocked it with a small brass key pulled from his coat pocket and returned holding a thin, leather-bound book, its cover worn soft with age. He set it gently on the table between them, as though the object itself deserved a kind of careful respect. "This belonged to my grandfather," Aurelio said. "It was written during a period this family does not speak of openly, even now. Your grandmother is mentioned throughout it, though never by name. He refers to her only as the translator, as though naming her directly might somehow expose her to the danger he was trying to protect her from." Alina reached out and opened the book carefully, her fingers moving over pages filled with dense, formal Latin script, the same careful handwriting style she recognized from the letters hidden in her grandmother's wooden box. She began reading silently, her eyes moving quickly across sentences describing land disputes, financial arrangements, and quiet agreements made between powerful families decades ago. Then, several pages in, she found a passage that made her breath catch. The passage described an incident involving a rival family, the Dracots, who had once attempted to seize a portion of Castellan land through a forged inheritance claim. According to the entry, Aurelio's grandfather had uncovered the forgery only because a young translator, hired quietly and paid in silence, had recognized inconsistencies in the handwriting and phrasing of the supposedly ancient documents the Dracots had presented as proof. "She caught them," Alina said quietly, almost to herself. "My grandmother caught someone trying to steal land through forged papers." "She did more than catch them," Aurelio said. "She proved it in a courtroom, using her own knowledge of formal Latin phrasing from that period. The Dracots never forgave my family for the humiliation, and they certainly never forgave your grandmother." Alina looked up sharply. "Are the Dracots still around?" Aurelio's expression grew more serious. "They are, and that is precisely why I asked my lawyers to handle this matter quietly and quickly, before anyone outside this house realized certain documents were even being discussed. If the Dracot family learns that new evidence connecting them to that old forgery still exists, and that the person capable of authenticating it is standing in this very room, I fear they will not respond calmly." A knock interrupted them before Alina could respond. The servant who had guided her earlier stepped inside, his expression tight with something like urgency. He informed Aurelio in a low voice that a visitor had arrived unannounced and was currently waiting in the front hall, refusing to leave until she had spoken with the Duke directly. "Who is it?" Aurelio asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Lady Dracot," the servant said. "She says she heard a woman was invited here to discuss old family documents, and she insists on knowing exactly what that means." Aurelio's jaw tightened, and for the first time since Alina had met him, she saw something close to genuine concern cross his face. He turned to Alina, lowering his voice as though the walls themselves might be listening. "Whatever happens next," he said, "you must not reveal how much you actually know. Not yet. Not until we understand exactly how much she suspects." Before Alina could respond, the study doors opened again, and a woman swept into the room with the confidence of someone who had never once been told to wait. Lady Dracot was tall, elegantly dressed in deep green, her silver-streaked hair pulled back into a severe knot that matched the sharpness of her expression. Her eyes moved immediately to Alina, assessing her with a cold, calculating gaze that made the earlier scrutiny from the lawyers seem almost gentle by comparison. "Aurelio," Lady Dracot said, her voice smooth and precise, "I was under the impression this meeting concerned private family matters. I did not realize you had invited outside guests. Elena Voss is here regarding an unrelated archival matter, Aurelio said smoothly, his tone giving nothing away. Nothing that concerns you, Margaret. Lady Draycott's gaze lingered on Elena a moment longer than necessary, and Elena forced herself to remain perfectly still, betraying nothing. She recognized, somewhere in the back of her mind, that whatever calm expression she managed to hold right now might matter more than anything she had said all day. Voss, Lady Draycott repeated slowly, tasting the name as though testing its familiarity. That name feels oddly familiar. Have we met before, Miss Voss? I don't believe so, Elena answered evenly, keeping her voice light. I work at a university library. I doubt our paths have crossed. Lady Draycott's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened, as though she sensed a door being closed just slightly too quickly. She turned back to Aurelio, her tone shifting into something more direct. I have heard rumors, she said, that certain old documents concerning my family's history have resurfaced, documents that were supposedly lost decades ago. I would hate to think anyone was planning to use forged or manipulated records to embarrass my family after all this time. Aurelio's expression remained perfectly composed, though Elena noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders. I can assure you, Margaret, nothing of that nature is happening in this house. Lady Draycott's smile was thin and unconvinced. See that it stays that way, she said quietly. My family has worked very hard to move past old disagreements. I would not want anyone stirring up matters better left buried. With that, she turned and left the room as abruptly as she had entered, her footsteps echoing sharply against the marble floor until the sound faded into silence. Aurelio exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, the first genuinely unguarded gesture Elena had seen from him since their conversation began. She suspects something, Elena said quietly. She always suspects something, Aurelio replied. The question is whether she suspects enough to act on it. Elena looked down at the old leather book still resting on the table, then back up at Aurelio, her mind already working through the implications of what she had just witnessed. If those documents prove her family committed forgery generations ago, what exactly would she stand to lose if the truth became public now? Aurelio considered the question carefully before answering. Land, reputation, possibly legal claims to properties her family still holds today, properties that were originally acquired through that same forged inheritance. If the original forgery could be proven conclusively, using documents authenticated by someone with genuine expertise in period Latin phrasing, it could unravel decades of ownership across several estates. And I'm the only person who can authenticate them, Elena said slowly, understanding settling over her like a weight. You are the only person alive who can, Aurelio confirmed. Which means, from this moment forward, you are no longer simply a woman collecting a fair settlement for your grandmother's work. You are the one person capable of finally proving what my family has always known privately but could never prove publicly. Elena sat back in her chair, processing the sudden shift in everything she thought she understood about why she had been summoned to this house. She had arrived expecting a quiet negotiation over old family papers. Instead, she now found herself standing at the center of something far larger, something involving land, inheritance, and a family determined to protect secrets that stretched back generations. What happens now? She asked. Aurelio studied her for a long moment before answering, his expression unusually serious. Now, he said, we need to determine exactly what your grandmother left behind, and how much of it can withstand the kind of scrutiny Lady Draycott's family will inevitably bring against it. If there are gaps, inconsistencies, or missing pieces, we need to know before she does. Elena thought immediately of the wooden box sitting in her apartment, still only partially examined, filled with letters and documents she had not yet fully translated. She realized, with a growing sense of urgency, that whatever answers existed likely remained hidden among those papers, waiting to be uncovered by the only person who still understood the language they were written in. "I need to go back through my grandmother's papers," Alina said. "All of them, carefully. There may be information there that even I haven't fully understood yet." Aurelio nodded slowly, already reaching for a small bell resting on the edge of the table. "Then we will send someone to retrieve everything from your apartment immediately, under careful supervision. I am not willing to risk those documents traveling through unprotected hands, not now that Margaret Draycott suspects something is happening." As a servant appeared at the study door in response to the bell, Alina felt a strange mixture of fear and determination settling over her. She thought again of her grandmother, sitting patiently at that kitchen table decades ago, insisting that understanding an old language was a kind of quiet power that could not be taken away once it was earned. She had never fully understood what her grandmother meant by that until this very moment, sitting inside a house filled with secrets, facing a family determined to protect a truth that had waited generations to be spoken aloud. Whatever came next, Alina understood clearly now that there was no turning back from what she had already begun. The wooden box arrived at Castellan Hall 2 hours later, carried in by a quiet, careful man Aurelio introduced simply as Rowan, someone he trusted completely, and had used before for matters requiring discretion. Alina watched as Rowan set the box down gently on the study table, treating it with the same careful respect Aurelio had shown the old leather book earlier. She ran her fingers over the familiar wood, feeling the same worn grooves she remembered from childhood, back when she used to sit beside her grandmother while the box remained locked, always locked, until the day her grandmother finally passed and left the small brass key behind with a note that simply said, "When you are ready." She had never fully understood that note until now. Alina opened the box carefully, lifting out bundles of letters tied together with faded ribbon, along with loose pages covered in her grandmother's careful, elegant handwriting. Aurelio sat across from her, patient but visibly eager, while Rowan remained near the door, standing guard over the room with quiet attentiveness. Alina began sorting through the papers methodically, separating personal letters from what appeared to be official documents, her eyes scanning quickly across formal Latin phrases she recognized from her earlier readings of the leather-bound book. Near the bottom of the box, beneath several layers of personal correspondence, Alina found a thick folder tied shut with string, its edges worn soft from handling. She untied it carefully and found herself looking at a collection of documents unlike anything else in the box. These pages were older, the paper thinner and more fragile, the handwriting different from her grandmother's familiar script. She recognized immediately that these were not letters her grandmother had written. These were the original documents themselves, the ones referenced in Aurelio's grandfather's book, the forged inheritance papers the Draycott family had once presented as proof of their claim. "These are them," Alina said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "These are the original forged documents." Aurelio leaned forward immediately, his earlier composure slipping into something closer to disbelief. "She kept the originals, not copies." "It looks that way," Alina said, carefully lifting the fragile pages and examining the handwriting with growing certainty. She pointed to several sections where the ink coloring shifted subtly, where certain letters were formed slightly differently than the rest of the document, inconsistencies that would be nearly invisible to anyone without her specific training in period Latin script. "Here," she said, indicating a signature near the bottom of one page. "This signature claims to be from a document supposedly written 70 years before it was actually created. But look at this letter formation and this phrasing structure. This style of writing didn't exist yet when this document claims to have been written. Whoever forged this was skilled, but not skilled enough to account for how language and handwriting shift generation to generation." Aurelio stared at the page, then back at Alina, something like awe crossing his expression. You can prove this conclusively. With enough time and the right comparison documents, yes, Alina said. This isn't guesswork. This is exactly the kind of inconsistency my grandmother would have caught the first time she examined these papers, which explains why she kept the originals rather than returning them. Before Aurelio could respond, the study door opened without a knock, and Rowan stepped aside just quickly enough to avoid being struck as Lady Draycott swept into the room once again, her expression far less composed than during her earlier visit. Her eyes went immediately to the table, to the fragile old papers spread across its surface, and something dangerous flickered behind her gaze. "I see," Lady Draycott said slowly, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, "that my earlier warning was not taken seriously." Aurelio rose from his chair immediately, positioning himself slightly between the table and the door, though he kept his voice calm and measured. "Margaret, this is a private matter concerning archival research, nothing more." "Do not insult me," Lady Draycott snapped, her composure cracking further with every word. "I have spent my entire life hearing whispers about forged documents connected to my family's inheritance, whispers I always dismissed as bitter gossip from families jealous of our success. But now I find a woman capable of reading old Latin script sitting in your study, examining papers pulled from a locked box. On the very same day I warned you against exactly this kind of investigation." Alina remained seated, forcing herself to stay calm despite the sudden spike of fear pulsing through her chest. She thought quickly, recognizing that whatever she said next might determine how this entire confrontation unfolded. "Lady Draycott," Alina said carefully, choosing her words with precision, "I understand this must feel alarming, but I think it would serve everyone better if the truth were established clearly, rather than left to whispers and rumors that have apparently followed your family for generations already." Lady Draycott turned her sharp gaze toward Alina, studying her with an intensity that made the earlier scrutiny from the lawyers seem gentle by comparison. "And what exactly do you believe the truth to be, Miss Voss?" Alina hesitated only a moment before deciding that honesty, delivered carefully, offered a better path forward than continued evasion. "I believe these documents will show that a claim made generations ago by your family was based on forged papers, papers created to imitate a period of handwriting that had not yet developed at the time they claimed to have been written." The room went completely silent. Lady Draycott's face drained of color for a brief moment before hardening into something colder and more controlled. "You cannot possibly prove such a thing." "I can," Alina said quietly, "and I intend to, carefully and honestly, regardless of what that proof ultimately reveals." Lady Draycott's hands tightened into fists at her sides, and for a moment Alina feared the confrontation might escalate into something neither of them could easily walk back from. But then, unexpectedly, something in Lady Draycott's expression shifted, the anger giving way slowly to something closer to exhaustion. "Do you have any idea," Lady Draycott said quietly, her voice suddenly much smaller than before, "what it feels like to spend an entire lifetime defending a legacy you always privately suspected was built on something rotten? I have heard those whispers my entire life. I dismissed them because the alternative felt unbearable." Alina studied her carefully, surprised by the sudden vulnerability replacing the earlier hostility. "Then perhaps," Alina said gently, "it would be better to finally know the truth, rather than spend the rest of your life defending something you already suspect is false." Lady Draycott was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the fragile old papers still spread across the table. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried none of its earlier sharpness. "If these documents truly prove what you believe they prove," she said slowly, "I would rather hear it from someone who approaches the matter honestly than continue living beneath a truth I have always been too afraid to face directly." Aurelio glanced at Alina, something like quiet respect passing between them, before turning back to Lady Draycott. "Then perhaps," he said carefully, It is time the three of us examine this matter together, rather than treating each other as enemies before we even understand what these papers actually reveal." Lady Draycott hesitated, then nodded slowly, pulling out a chair and seating herself at the table with visible reluctance. Alina felt the tension in the room shift, not disappearing entirely, but softening into something more workable, something closer to cautious cooperation than open conflict. As Alina began carefully explaining the specific inconsistencies she had identified within the old documents, walking both Aurelio and Lady Draycott through the subtle differences in handwriting and phrasing that revealed the forgery, she felt something settle inside her, a quiet confidence she had never quite experienced before. She was no longer simply a woman defending her grandmother's memory. She had become the person capable of finally revealing a truth that had waited generations to be spoken, using nothing more than the careful, patient language lessons her grandmother had insisted upon so many years ago. Whatever the final outcome of this discovery might be, Alina understood clearly now that the truth, however difficult, deserved to be known. 3 weeks passed before the matter reached its formal conclusion, weeks filled with careful examination, cautious meetings, and a slow, unexpected shift in the relationship between two families who had spent generations regarding each other with suspicion. Alina spent much of that time in a quiet room at Castellan Hall that Aurelio had arranged specifically for her research, surrounded by reference texts on historical Latin script, comparison documents pulled from university archives, and the fragile original papers her grandmother had protected for decades. The work required patience. Alina examined every letter formation, every ink variation, every subtle shift in phrasing across dozens of pages, building a case so thorough that no reasonable expert could dispute her conclusions. She cross-referenced the disputed inheritance documents against verified samples of authentic writing from the same historical period, demonstrating clearly and repeatedly that the handwriting style claimed to be 70 years old had, in fact, only existed for roughly 20 years before the documents were supposedly written. When she finally presented her complete findings, she did so not in the grand study where the confrontation had first begun, but in a smaller, quieter room where Aurelio, Lady Draycott, and a neutral historical expert brought in from the university sat together around a modest table. Alina walked them through her evidence methodically, translating each disputed phrase, explaining each inconsistency, allowing the documents themselves to reveal their own contradictions rather than relying on her word alone. The independent expert, a careful and precise woman named Charlotte Hendry, who had spent decades studying historical manuscripts, reviewed Alina's work line by line before finally setting down her notes and looking around the table with quiet certainty. "I have examined Miss Voss's analysis thoroughly," Charlotte said, "and I find no fault in her conclusions. These documents were created significantly later than they claim to represent. The forgery is subtle, skillfully executed, but ultimately undeniable once examined against verified historical samples." Lady Draycott sat quietly for a long moment, her expression unreadable, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the earlier hostility that had defined their first encounters. "Then it is true," she said softly. "My family's claim to those lands was never legitimate." "It appears that way," Aurelio said gently, his tone carrying none of the satisfaction one might expect from a man whose family had just been vindicated after generations of quiet suspicion. "Though I want to be clear, Margaret, that none of this reflects poorly on you personally. Whatever happened generations ago was not your doing." Lady Draycott was quiet for a long moment before nodding slowly, something like relief settling over her features despite the difficult truth she had just been forced to accept. "I have spent my entire life defending something I always privately feared was false," she said. "Strangely, knowing the truth feels less painful than continuing to defend a lie." The formal legal proceedings that followed were handled with far more care and respect than the earlier meeting with Gerald Ashcombe and his colleagues had suggested was possible. Rather than pursuing an aggressive reclaiming of disputed lands, Aurelio proposed a quiet, careful settlement, one that acknowledged the historical wrongdoing without punishing a family for decisions made by ancestors long since past. Lady Draycott, to her credit, did not fight the proposal, choosing instead to work alongside Aurelio's legal team to determine a fair and reasonable resolution for both families. Throughout those weeks of careful negotiation, Alina found herself increasingly drawn into conversations with Aurelio that extended well beyond the original matter of forged documents and disputed inheritance. He asked her, more than once, about her work at the university library, about the years she had spent quietly cataloging forgotten manuscripts, about the patience required to piece together fragments of history that most people never thought to examine closely. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she enjoyed those conversations more than she expected, discovering in Aurelio a genuine curiosity about history that matched her own. One afternoon, as the formal negotiations neared their conclusion, Aurelio invited Alina into the same grand study where their first meeting had taken place weeks earlier. The room felt different now, warmer somehow, though nothing about its physical appearance had changed. Gerald Ashcombe stood near the table, along with Adrian Locke and Nathaniel Price, all three considerably more subdued than they had been during their first encounter. Aurelio gestured toward a fresh contract laid out across the table, its pages far shorter than the dense legal document Alina had first been presented weeks earlier. He explained that this new agreement reflected not just fair compensation for the documents her grandmother had protected, but formal recognition of her grandmother's role in preserving the Castellan family's true history, along with an offer extended directly to Alina herself. "I would like to offer you a permanent position," Aurelio said, "overseeing the preservation and translation of this family's historical archive, not as an outside contractor brought in to settle an old debt, but as someone with genuine expertise this family has clearly needed for far longer than we realized." Alina looked down at the contract, reading through its terms carefully, nodding with quiet satisfaction that every clause was written clearly, without the deliberately obscured language the original document had relied upon. The compensation offered reflected genuine respect, rather than a quiet attempt to settle matters cheaply, and the position itself offered exactly the kind of meaningful work Alina had spent her entire career searching for without quite realizing it. "Before I sign anything," Alina said, glancing toward Gerald Ashcombe with a small, knowing smile, "I want to make sure every word of this contract has been read aloud, clearly, in whatever language I choose." Gerald Ashcombe's expression flickered with something between embarrassment and reluctant amusement. "Of course, Miss Voss. Latin or English, whichever you prefer." Alina picked up the contract herself, and rather than asking someone else to read it, she began reading the terms aloud in careful, precise Latin, translating each clause immediately afterward into English for anyone in the room who might have doubted her fluency. She noted every detail, every provision, every protection built into the agreement, ensuring nothing had been quietly altered or obscured the way the original contract had attempted weeks earlier. When she finished, she looked up at Aurelio, her expression calm but resolute. "This is fair," she said simply. "This is honest." "Then perhaps," Aurelio said, sliding a pen across the table toward her, "it is finally time to sign." Alina picked up the pen, glancing briefly at the three lawyers who had once assumed she would simply accept whatever terms they offered without question. Gerald Ashcombe met her gaze steadily, offering a small, respectful nod that carried genuine acknowledgement of how thoroughly his earlier assumptions had been proven wrong. Adrian Locke and Nathaniel Price stood quietly beside him, both considerably more humble than during their first meeting. Alina signed the contract carefully, her signature steady and deliberate, marking not just the resolution of a decades-old family dispute, but the beginning of something entirely new. As she set down the pen, she felt a quiet sense of completion settle over her, the feeling of having honored her grandmother's memory not through simple compensation, but through genuine recognition of the courage her grandmother had shown decades earlier, courage that had waited patiently, hidden inside a locked wooden box, until the right moment finally arrived to reveal it. In the weeks that followed, Alina settled into her new role within the Castellan estate, spending her days surrounded by centuries of carefully preserved documents, continuing the work her grandmother had begun so many years before. She maintained a careful, professional friendship with Lady Dracot, who visited occasionally to review the historical findings that had reshaped both their families' understanding of the past, their earlier hostility replaced by a cautious, mutual respect built on honesty rather than suspicion. Aurelio remained a steady presence throughout those weeks, often joining Alina in the archive room during quiet afternoons, asking thoughtful questions about the documents she uncovered, occasionally sharing stories about his own family's history that added context to the careful translations Alina provided. Their conversations grew easier over time, comfortable in a way neither of them had quite expected, when their first meeting began with three lawyers attempting to reduce Alina's grandmother's legacy into a simple financial transaction. Late one evening, as Alina organized a newly discovered collection of letters within the archive room, she found herself thinking back to that first tense meeting weeks earlier, remembering the quiet satisfaction she had felt reading the original contract back to those three lawyers in fluent Latin, watching their confident expressions crumble the moment they realized she understood every word they had assumed she could not follow. She thought of her grandmother then, sitting patiently at that kitchen table decades ago, insisting that Alina learn a language most people considered outdated and unnecessary. She understood now, more fully than ever, exactly what her grandmother had been preparing her for all those years, not simply the ability to translate old documents, but the quiet, unshakable confidence that came from understanding something others assumed you did not know. Alina closed the leather-bound book resting on her desk, the same one Aurelio had first shown her weeks earlier, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Whatever challenges still waited ahead, she felt certain now that she possessed exactly the tools needed to face them, tools her grandmother had spent years quietly, patiently building within her, long before either of them understood exactly how much they would eventually matter. The truth, once buried and protected inside a locked wooden box, had finally found its way into the light, carried forward by the very language her grandmother had insisted would matter one day. And as Alina looked around the quiet archive room that had become her new home, she understood clearly that this was only the beginning of the story her grandmother had started, one careful translation at a time.